It is imperative that the Trail of Tears Association ensure that the record of what was done to the First Nations of the southeastern United States remains as relevant a story today as it was 180 years ago.
An amazing story that the people, the ancestors of the Eastern Band, purposefully enacted and saw their way all the way through all the suffering that it took to remain here.
The Cherokee wanted to create, they wanted to communicate with themselves, but most importantly, they wanted to communicate with the world.
So ancestral Cherokee people are cosmopolitan people. They had deep and wide social networks.
One disillusioned soldier wrote that he was paid to commit a crime, to defend a fraudulent treaty with, in his words, the vilest machinations man or demon could invent.
And if you understand the Trail of Tears, and if you don't forget the Trail of Tears, when you go on to study just what happened in the 19th century after the Cherokee people got to their new homelands, picked themselves back up, and rebuilt a great society and a great democracy and a government built on the rule of law.
We don't do this to shame or blame. We do it because it's an opportunity for us to say to the world, our ancestors persevered. They had tenacity and resilience. They refused to be victims. They rebuilt the Cherokee Nation.
So I think that y'all should give yourselves a round of applause for all that you've accomplished in the last 25 years.
You didn't sign up to be warriors in this battle. Your efforts to speak plainly about the Trail of Tears, to preserve the history, helps push back on this nonsense. So we are bringing back the history course for the Cherokee people, by the Cherokee people, so that this generation of Cherokees coming up will know their own history.
Thank you all very much for coming to hear my talk today. I gave it a really awful title, hoping that folks wouldn't show up to it, but here you are. So here we are indeed. And I guess first of all, I'm Dr. Ben Steere. I'm a professor over at Western Carolina University. Want to welcome you to Cherokee if you have not been here before. You got especially good weather to be in such a beautiful place, so welcome, welcome. And I want to take a moment too to thank the Trail of Tears Association for all the hard work organizing this conference. There's a lot of work goes into this, so thanks to them. My paper is titled Cherokee Architecture, New Insights from Cultural Resource Management, Archaeology in Southwestern North Carolina. And the very, very short thesis for this talk is that over the last 20 years, there have been a series of really massive cultural resource management projects here in southwestern North Carolina that have essentially uncovered the entire footprints of ancestral Cherokee communities here in this part of the world. And some of my colleagues and I, in a lot of ways, are still kind of just starting to synthesize that new work and try and make sense of what it means. And I was delighted to have this opportunity to share this information in Cherokee, in particular with folks from Cherokee Nation, Eastern Band of Cherokee Indians, and what does it all mean, right? What is this for? There's been a whole lot of earth moving in the last 20 years, and it turns out there's a lot of really interesting new stuff we've learned. I want to begin my paper with acknowledgments because I've got a bad habit of running my talks fast at the end. So a lot of all the work that you're going to see presented today was overseen by the Eastern Band of Cherokee Indians Tribal Historic Preservation Office. I'll be sharing work that was primarily done by TRC, a company, archaeology firm that's contracted for many projects with the Eastern Band of Cherokee Indians, and especially my good colleagues Tasha Benishek and Paul Webb are the actual archaeologists who have done and directed much of the field work that I'll be sort of synthesizing and talking about today. My colleagues at Western Carolina, Brett Riggs, of course, who you all know, but also Jane Eastman, another archaeologist, and cultural expert Tom Belt have been very helpful in helping me interpret this information. And then also the Western Carolinas Hunter Library. I have sort of a university research fellowship this year, and I get to teach fewer classes and spend more time in the library. So some of the work I'm presenting today comes from that fellowship I'm doing right now. This is a place that many of you may be familiar with. It's the new, I still think of it as the new Cherokee K-12 school, although it's been up and running for over 10 years now. But this is sort of how I remember the Cherokee School Complex, because I spent the first half of my 20s on my hands and knees working down there. When TRC was doing archaeology over the footprint of that school site. This is a photograph taken in either late 2004, early 2005, of a group of Cherokee students from the Cherokee AP History class coming to visit the future site of the Cherokee School. And they're standing over the remains of a circa 1740s Cherokee winter house that's being excavated there by archaeologists working with TRC. This is really where I fell in love with doing Cherokee archaeology, and particularly doing collaborative archaeology, with folks from the Eastern Band, and trying to, quickly and directly report results from field work that was happening. So it's also where I sort of fell in love with houses. This is the overall site map of the Ravensford sites. It's really multiple archaeology sites, multiple components. Again, there's, for folks who are familiar with this landscape, there's the old Big Cove Road that you may have been familiar with, and then, the newly routed Big Cove Road. And, over the footprint of this 40-acre archaeological excavation, I think to date the largest excavation in the state of North Carolina, the real star of the show there were these well-preserved ancestral Cherokee houses. I know this is kind of a hard map to see, especially if you're there in the back, but in the red here are 18th century Cherokee households, so house pairs of well-preserved winter and summer houses, 1, 2, 3, 4, so 4 households represented there from the 18th century. In blue is what we'd call a early Qualla to middle Qualla phase houses, so roughly 1400s, 1500s, so a community there from that time period. And then in the green, using archaeological terminology based on the house patterns and ceramics, maybe an early Pisgah phase community, that would be around 1000 to 1300 AD, give or take. So multiple communities were out there at Ravensford, and you can see change over time. And what's particularly cool about Ravensford is, we're here in the outtowns, and this is like out in the outtowns. This is a kind of like a rural community, and so it's a really remarkable opportunity to get a chance to look at almost like a complete rural community, a little bit farther away from kind of the action at Nanunyi and other mound sites and stuff closer here, a little bit more distant from Gadua, and so it offers a really interesting look at daily life, and so this is the kind of data I'll be talking about today, sort of using large excavations and house patterns to look at communities, ancestral Cherokee communities over time, and see how they're changing and think about what that means. Again, just one more example from Ravensford, partly to get you into the mindset of looking at architectural data. As archaeologists, we carefully excavate almost like the blueprint of these houses, right? What you see when you look at the architectural remains of ancestral Cherokee houses are the remains of post-in-ground construction, so digging post holes, setting upright posts to then frame up your houses. And so we can look at these excavation maps much like blueprints that then help us sort of reconstruct these houses. So I show you this one just because it's something you're probably familiar with for this particular crowd, which has a higher archaeology IQ than most crowds I talk to. That 18th century Cherokee winter house, summer house pair. This is what it looks like on the ground, sort of in blueprint form, and then of course an artist's reconstruction there for you. So over the last 20 years, there have been several large-scale excavations in southwestern North Carolina, many of them tribally sponsored, fieldwork carried out by TRC and other CRM companies under the direction of the Eastern Band's THPO. And just kind of for funsies, this is a recent one. This is what's under the new parking lot that's currently under construction right outside. at a site the archaeologists would call 31JK291, or the Magic Water site. So thanks to Tasha Benishek for showing this hot off the presses map. This is a pigeon phase community, so early middle woodland, like maybe 400 AD, give or take. Large circular houses, and then, you know, sort of many of which were reconstructed over time as households come and go. But throughout time, sort of like a clear, open, almost like a plaza area that would have been the center of that community. So, you know, this is currently under that gravel parking lot just outside. Per Tasha and other archaeologists who work up here, this is one of the earliest, best preserved, you know, permanent middle woodland villages, like in the state. And this is really significant, you know, and this is like one of many really significant archaeological sites I'm going to show you that I think in the coming years are really going to, you know, change the way that we think about sort of, you know, the ancestral Cherokee landscape out here. So without further ado, here we go. So I've been interested in architecture for a long time, and especially, so just to back up a little bit, I teach in the Department of Anthropology and Sociology at Western Carolina, and my department head says sometimes that I'm like a closet sociologist, and that's because I'm really interested in big scale patterns of change. I think what archaeologists are really good at is pattern recognition, and in particular when we have a whole lot of data, to step back from it and kind of take that 10,000 foot view and you know, look at you know, entire communities changing over time. I think that's a real strength of our discipline. So that's a thing that I'm interested in doing, is comparing how communities change over time. And specifically here in this part of the Cherokee world, one thing that looking at changing architectural styles and community layouts can do is help us to understand social and cultural ties among indigenous communities right here in southwestern North Carolina and beyond. So ancestral Cherokee people are cosmopolitan people. They had deep and wide social networks. Coming out of this recent research from TRC is lots of evidence for large public buildings, including at sites that are not like big central mound sites, but sites like Ravensford that are off the beaten path a little bit. We have some public buildings out there. And I'll show some other examples well. And you know, public buildings, these large houses that are definitely not just, you know, one person's house, but a place for a community to get together, that's the material record of communities getting together and making decisions through processes that are, you know, we might call democratic. So councils and clans and lineages, you know, sending representatives, having debates about issues, getting together, the material record of that is public buildings, or one material record of that is public buildings. And so we can see some kind of like proto-council houses in some of these new archaeology sites. And then, you know, big picture, especially for here at this particular conference, the Trail of Tears Association conference, this is another way to understand Cherokee adaptation and resilience. Another way not just to sort of, you know, march through time looking at various cultural phases, but see through houses how Cherokee people are adapting to changing social and cultural landscapes. And toward the end, I'll talk about some really big through lines that stretch back over this, you know, 1,500-year period we'll talk about today, in particular in terms of this long tradition of decision-making by councils, clans, and lineages that we can see all the way up through, you know, today, for example. Okay. So I'm going to try and breeze through this background, but for my dissertation research at the University of Georgia, after I spent a few years working up here, like doing honest work, doing archaeological field work, before I went off to graduate school, I spent the first half of my 20s like actually excavating houses, and then like the second half of my 20s counting post holes. This is from the counting post hole phase of my archaeological career. I did a really big comparative study of architecture across the Southeast. So trying to understand across a broad swath of the southeastern US how indigenous houses were changing over time. I compared over 1,200 structures from 65 sites across the Southeast, representing 95 different components across the Southeast. So I looked at a lot of houses, again, second half of my 20s, down in the basement, counting post holes. But it was worth it. It was totally worth it, and I'll show you why. These are the kind of data I was working with in this dissertation work. So, house plans from a place like Ravensford, looking at a carefully excavated summer and winter houses, and public buildings as well. So there's the famous townhouse from the Coweta Creek site. We went a little bit north of Coweta Creek on our tour yesterday down in Macon County. We never got that far south, but well documented 1500s, 1600s occupation down there. These are the kind of data I was looking at and comparing how these houses were changing over time. Looked at over 1,000 domestic structures, over 120 public structures, also storage buildings and stuff. This is all to say that I looked at an awful lot of data to identify sort of big patterns of changes in houses across the Southeast. This then provides a kind of baseline for comparison for looking at this new cultural resource management data we have that's come out of Southwestern NC in the last 20 years. So just quick kind of greatest hits. Middle woodland period, so as far back as 200 BC to 600 AD. There's a lot of variability in houses, and speaking broadly across the Southeast, and so we can think about what they look like here, but in general, tend to be round in shape, sometimes square with sort of rounded corners, quite a bit of variation in size, although in general, houses are pretty big, probably large enough to house like extended families. So maybe 6-8 people, even more potentially living together under a single roof. Late woodland period, again, sort of some variation, but circles and squares and getting a little smaller. For archaeology fans in the room, this might be like a house form you're familiar with, the sort of famous wall trenches of the early Mississippian period, but then also single post construction. Here in sort of the southwest corner of our state, we tend to see more just kind of single post flex pole construction type buildings. Folks aren't really doing wall trenches here, which is kind of interesting. Again, just kind of providing background. Houses get bigger and more square during the middle Mississippian period. And then after about 1350, we see the development across a broad swath of the Southeast, particularly northern Georgia, East Tennessee, and southwestern North Carolina, of this winter house form that, again, if you study Cherokee history, you're probably familiar with. If you've been out to reconstructed villages, this is often the kind of house form that you see, this winter house set into a little bit of a basin with entryway trenches, widespread across Georgia, western North Carolina, East Tennessee, even into South Carolina a little bit in the 14th and 15th and 16th centuries. And then 18th century, there's those Cherokee house pairs you're probably familiar with. So that's kind of a greatest hits tour, just to and then sort of like a diagram showing how these houses change over time. The reason this is useful, again, is that it provides a backdrop for comparing specifically what are folks doing in southwestern North Carolina, how does this compare with broader trends in changing house styles across the Southeast, and what can that tell us specifically about folks here. This is one of many histograms for my dissertation. And I didn't really think that much about this when I first published it, but this may actually be one of the most important things I sort of landed on in that work, which is if you look at the average size of domestic houses, such as kind of regular houses for folks here in the Southeast, there's a kind of maximum size limit for domestic houses. That's actually kind of interesting anthropologically. If you think about some other cultures in the Americas, you might think about Iroquois longhouses, for example, right? Iroquois longhouses, you get like apartment-style construction. Those boys get big, right? You're talking, domestic houses that are like hundreds of feet long. You might think about the American Southwest, where you get like apartment-style buildings. Think about Chaco Canyon and the great houses there, right? You get domestic structures that are like apartment-style. And we seem to prefer single-family homes here in the Southeast. This is kind of interesting. It looks like they kind of max out at about 40 square meters or so. If you get much over 20 to 25 feet per side on a house in the Southeast, you're getting into public structures. That's kind of neat, just culturally. It's kind of a long-standing tradition of a house that's big enough to house a nuclear family or an extended family, and then you have a council house or a public building for your public meetings. So it's just kind of an interesting sort of baseline that can then be useful. So why do you count 1,200 houses during your 20s instead of going outside and playing? Well, there it is. Like, there's an interesting kind of baseline you can use for comparison that helps us interpret, the architecture down here. So what I'll do now is I've pulled 3 greatest hits from recent cultural resource management work here in Southwestern North Carolina, and as I go through this kind of show and tell, I'm going to pull out some of the really interesting things that we're learning about architecture from this recent work, and in particular focus on new things, new insights, findings from this work, particularly related to architecture, that are I think really actually changing the way that we think about long-term Cherokee history and culture. So we're going to start just up the road at Ravensford. I've got all 3 sites on here. We're going to start at Ravensford. We're then going to go down to the 18th century Cherokee town of Iotla, or Jory, also known as the Macon County Airport. And then we'll wrap up at Talishishguayahi, Two Sparrows Town at Western Carolina, where I teach. And at each of these places, I'll sort of draw out some themes and things we're learning about the architecture from these sites. I guess we got our bus stuck here yesterday, more or less. You've all got good stories, right? There we go. So we'll start with Ravensford. Again, just recent Google Map imagery. We're here, roughly. And so just up Big Cove Road is the Ravensford site. Again, huge archaeological site, 40 acres. Over 100 structures in total were recorded at this site, showing, allowing us to see change over time in these communities there. It's such a huge area. It's a little bit hard to kind of, land on the right scale for showing this architecture, but I'm going to do my best. Once again, moving backwards through time, these nicely spaced out Cherokee households from the 1740s, a little community there from the, say, roughly 1400s. And even at this scale, you can sort of make out, you've got domestic structures there, and then, I'm not going to talk about this one today, really, but a larger, public-looking building there for that community. And then this community from roughly 1000 to 1300 AD down here in the green, that's where I'm going to really focus today. So these are houses that are associated with, what we'd call early Pisgah phase ceramics, rectilinear stamped ceramics, and the houses themselves look like they're single pole construction, so folks using small posts and kind of bending them together to make houses. And just trying to sort of zoom in on this area. This time period in southwestern North Carolina, the early Pisgah phase, so again, roughly 1000 to 1300 AD, isn't terribly well understood. In a lot of syntheses of North Carolina archaeology, we're still kind of pulling from sites that were excavated from UNC, like back in the 60s and 70s even, like the Warren Wilson site, again, for folks who know their archaeology, is like the classic Pisgah phase site, tends to influence how we think about Pisgah. Here's something really different. This is cool. We're far away from, relatively speaking, far away from a mound site here, but you've got some domestic structures. So one, two, 3, 4, 5, 6 families, nuclear extended families living in this community here, and then you've got two there and 1, so a total of 3 large public buildings. So big enough to probably hold certainly meetings from people at that community, certainly big enough to kind of house community level discussions, but maybe also even big enough to be a meeting place for folks who are living up the Raven Fork River there, sort of what we consider like the Big Cove community now, right? Maybe folks can kind of come down and have a local place for discussions. These are those public structures from Ravensford, and they've got fairly simple open floor plans, sort of rectangular with rounded corners, or in this case, sort of a square shape. You can see a single central post there, central support post there, and then one that probably got lost with some other features creeping in. And then this structure with, sort of one square side and then sort of a rounded side there and that central support post. They look very open on the inside. Not a whole lot of evidence of like necessarily room for benches or site furniture that we could sort of sort out in those houses, but you know, looking like big open public structures. If these two are contemporaneous, they might be paired structures with a plaza area in the middle. That would be sort of interesting. We could think about, you know, what that means. But again, in this community that's a little bit far off the beaten path, good evidence for public structures for folks to come together. So much of our thinking about this time period, and I've been very guilty about this and doing this in some of my own writing, is, you know, we tend to think about mounds as like the center for political action. And you got to have a mound, you know, to sort of be like an important center. Well, you know, here's these public buildings that could have provided a place for folks in these communities to come together, make decisions, you know, helps us maybe picture a more kind of active civic life, right, at these communities. This is an artist's reconstruction of the Warren Wilson site, which again, you know, sort of dominates is like, you know, the example of like a late Pisgah phase site, tends to sort of dominate the way that we think about this time period. But, you know, here's, you know, a very different model, you know, for what a Pisgah phase community looks like. So adding diversity, adding some nuance to our understanding of this time period. And that's just sort of one thing we've got out of Ravensford, right? That's like one component from that site. So now down to Macon County we go. You can really relive our trauma from yesterday over there at Cowie now. There's the Watauga site that Dr. Riggs talked about in his opener, Niquosi, where we all visited yesterday, and the Cherokee town of Iotla or Jory. TRC conducted a large-scale excavation for a runway expansion out there at the site, and so what I'll do is show you some of the archaeology from that runway expansion project. Again, the goal with that project was to, you know, identify archaeological remains and to protect possible ancestral Cherokee graves that could be impacted by that project. Those graves were all protected in place, and again, we have an opportunity there to look at a nearly complete view of the community. So there's the area that was investigated for that runway expansion. And here's your annual vision exam. This is the site map from the Macon County Airport. And, you know, unlike Ravensford, where the different, you know, areas of occupation are kind of spaced out, I mean, you can sort of make it out. We've got this delightful palimpsest of occupation, right? So folks building and rebuilding in place over time. But fortunately, the archaeologists at TRC are really good at sorting out these time periods, you know, sorting out which posts go with which pottery and which phases over time. And so I'm just going to point out a couple of interesting new things we've learned just initially from the Macon County Airport site. So thank you, Tasha Benesek, for sorting out where the houses go. This is the Conestee phase village, so a middle woodland phase community. So we'll say circa 500, 600 AD, give or take. And what we can see at the site there is you have a couple of different sort of predominant styles of buildings. These circular structures, really, really carefully executed, circular buildings, and then, you know, square with rounded corner buildings, and then a couple of large open areas. You've got rebuilding in place over time. You can sort of, you know, you can sort of see places where obviously the buildings could not have been there at the same time. There's rebuilding happening, right? But you have this kind of general sense of a community plan. First of all, this is probably now one of the best examples of a Conestee phase community, like ever, in the archaeological record. Not to oversell it, but these are really significant archaeology sites that are really going to change our understanding of the Cherokee world out here. And, you know, these house forms relate to other middle woodland phase houses and other middle woodland phenomenon across the southeast. So if you're familiar with the idea of the Hopewell interaction sphere, that during the Middle Woodland period, there's broad networks of exchange really all through the eastern North America. If anyone's familiar with Middle Woodland earthworks around Ohio, like the famous Hopewell earthworks and the Newark earthworks and stuff, you see an awful lot of these sort of paired circles and squares, paired circles and squircles, like squares with rounded corners. And so that particular architectural style may also relate to ways in which the people living there in Macon County are communicating with, participating in these broader networks of exchange, broader information exchange ideas that are, really pan-eastern woodlands, right? That stretch all the way from Florida up to Maine in some cases. Just one comparative example, this is from Dr. Alice Wright's work at the famous Garden Creek mound site. This is a mound site over in outside of in Haywood County, outside of Canton, and doing some GPR work and other remote sensing work out there. They've identified these sort of square with rounded corner enclosures. Earlier work at Garden Creek by Benny Keel found evidence of these sort of square with truncated corner structures out there. And so even just locally, we can see, architecturally some connections over on the other side of the Balsam Mountains over there in Haywood County. So at a minimum, we can see some regional scale connections, and then of course probably some much broader scale connections as well. Also, at Macon County Airport, or the Oatla site, there is, we've got that really well documented early Pisgah phase community over at Ravensford. So, Ravensford, 1000 to 1300 AD. We've got those public structures that are sort of interesting and new. Meanwhile, in Macon County, we have another community here, roughly dates to between 1000 and 1300 AD, where we see something different. People are building palisades. You don't build a palisade for funsies. You build a palisade because you're concerned about defense, probably. And we see architectural styles there that in some ways are really similar to what we're seeing at Ravensford. So single post houses, some of which may have been within this palisade, others which either predate it or postdate it. There's also a large segmented ditch feature that likely dates to before this palisade was constructed, likely dates to before this building was constructed. These segmented ditch features actually appear at several sites across southwestern North Carolina that have been recently excavated. They may represent the remains of an early mound site, and all that we're sort of like a late woodland period mound site, and all that we're seeing now is sort of the remains of the construction. There's some different ideas about what these things mean. But they also might speak to sort of continuity in site placement. People have long memories, people have oral histories, they know where important places are, and they're rebuilding on top of these important places. Again, thinking about public structures, more evidence of these large buildings within palisades. The ceramics at Macon County Airport, predominantly that tend to associate with the palisade and the structures here are Etowah phase ceramics. Those are ceramics that we tend to see in northern Georgia that date to around 1100 to 1300. So showing south of Cowie Mountain there, maybe some more connections and ties with folks like in northern Georgia, East Tennessee, which would, you get to drive over Cowie Mountain yesterday. You might appreciate how Cowie Mountain might sort of influence some of your social relationships on a day-to-day basis. And again, just increasing the number of well-recorded villages that we have here in the mountains. At Macon County Airport also, there's one of these middle Qualla phase communities, so these winter houses that, again, if you're familiar with Cherokee history, familiar with reconstructions of villages, you've probably seen these things or seen reconstructions of them in your travels. This particular house form is really common across southwest North Carolina, also common in northern Georgia. I have some examples from northern Georgia here. Widespread southern Appalachian house form. And so we can think about the ways in which people at, Macon County Airport, Ravensford, and many, many other sites have been excavated across southwestern North Carolina are living in houses that speak to a really broadly shared, set of cultural ideas about the right way to build a house, may speak to widely shared social networks, exchanges of people and partners over a broad landscape. And then finally, to our own backyard at Western Carolina University, I'm going to talk about a couple of recent excavations there and sort of the new things that we've learned. So here is our campus, Talishishguayahi, Two Sparrows Town, located in Cullowhee Valley. And if you haven't been to Western's campus at some point, I invite you to come and visit us. Good luck parking, but you know how that goes. And here I am going to be, with permission, using from my good colleague Jane Eastman, who teaches with me at Western, and I'm thankful also to Brett for his help on these projects, and to TRC as well. So just kind of placing our campus here. Two Sparrows Town, Talishishguayahi, was marked with a townhouse mound that would have been sort of the public structure for a robust community there in the certainly 1700s, maybe even earlier, and certainly a little bit later. That mound tragically was destroyed by the university in 1956. But through recent excavations, we've really learned that a lot of the sort of record of Cherokee heritage on our campus is surprisingly intact. And so I'm going to show recent excavations from a couple of sites on campus. One is a site known as the Norton Field site. This is in front of a dormitory in some intramural fields that are sort of part of a bigger construction process and will eventually be sort of like nice crowned soccer fields. And then some archaeology for our new science building, which is now up and running. And these two sites, the science building site is really quite close to the former location of the mound that was on our campus. I'm actually going to talk about an earlier community there. And then the Norton Field site is sort of around the bend from Buzzard's Roost there. You can see Cullowhee Creek coming through as well. But these are both really significant sites in a place that we already know is quite significant. So starting with Norton Field, again, this was a project to do archaeology before the construction of some new intramural fields. Just a footprint of the site there. And at Norton, and some of you, if anybody was on our campus for the 2019 Rooted in the Mountains Symposium, you actually got a chance to go out there and walk around a little bit. I talked to a couple folks from the conference who've actually been out there on that site. For any Western alum, this is Norton Dormitory just off here to the side. And this field was at one time a driving range, and through 2019 was just kind of like mixed-use recreational fields. There's like a disc golf course out there and stuff. I mentioned that because the land use out there was really pretty light impact, not a lot of grading. And so there was actually really good archaeological preservation out there. And at this Norton Field site, and I'll show a zoomed-in version, but just kind of quickly, we have another Pisgah phase village. So again, another well-recorded Pisgah phase, a time period we used to not know a whole lot about, circa 1000, 1200 AD. We have another example here at Western. And if you're getting used to looking at floor plans now, there's another obvious public structure within the palisade of this Pisgah phase community. And we also have later Qualla phase, so paired winter-summer houses out there as well. Zooming in on Norton Field, here's this palisade arcing around. We just managed to catch a large public structure there and a couple of Pisgah phase domestic structures, so regular houses. This dormitory is built in part on fill dirt, and so there may even be more of this village intact underneath that dormitory, which is really interesting to think about. TRC did this excavation, was also able to preserve some ancestral Cherokee graves out there safely in advance of this project. So yet another data point, yet another example of these public structures. And then finally, archaeology carried out for our new science building, and we've sort of all had a hand on this one. I think that Jane and Brett and I and TRC have all, sort of had shovels in the ground at various times for this work around the new science building. This is from Jane showing probably the overall footprint of that Cherokee town that was associated with the townhouse mound, basically all the flat, well-drained land at the base of Buzzard's Roost there. And I'm going to zoom in on one area. This is now under sort of like a courtyard entrance to the new science building. It's labeled NT. It was under the former Nigley Theater. So if there are any Western Carolina theater majors in the audience, I'm sorry for what you're about to see. But this was demolition of the former theater building there on campus, making way for the new science building. And I showed this slide in part just to remind folks that you find stuff under pavement. This is sort of the remains of the foundation of that theater building, and then Killian Drive through here. So it's always worth looking under parking lots, because under this particular parking lot, and again, very difficult, working conditions with all this construction, but another large Pisgah-Faith public building, remains of another Pisgah-Faith building, and another one there that may be a domestic structure. Kind of zooming in, similar size and scale to the ones that you saw out at Ravensford, certainly similar to the size and scale of the one out at Norton Field, another one of these sort of rectangular with rounded end structures, and then sort of a mess of confusing posts that certainly have some other houses in there that can probably still be sorted out. Just multiplying the number of good examples we have of public buildings from this time period, domestic buildings from this time period. So just tremendous potential to learn a lot more about this important moment in ancestral Cherokee culture and time. So, stepping back, boy, you've looked at a lot of slides, right? I appreciate that. What does it mean? What are some new insights that we can get from these comparative architectural studies? So a few takeaways. One, this is really useful, helpful information for understanding relationships between and among communities here in Southwestern North Carolina and communities further afield. And so looking at, again, being careful not to just in a simple-minded way equate pots and houses with people. We do have a lot of tools for thinking about how folks are interacting with other communities on the landscape. House building in particular is a community affair. Houses are built by families for families. Think about patterns of marriage and people maybe relocating to live with their wife's family. The way that housing traditions are kind of moving around in the context of marriage, along with trade and exchange. This is a really useful set of tools that can help us understand social networks in the Southeast better. In particular for the Middle Woodland period and the early Mississippian period. Having big architectural data sets and big ceramic data sets as well, I think are really going to improve our understanding of how folks here in the Cherokee heartland are interacting with other people farther afield. Again, thinking about that idea that big public buildings are the material remains for decision-making by councils, clans, and lineages is really helpful, and kind of leads to the next point that so much of thinking in Southeastern archaeology, and again, just like mea culpa, I've been very guilty of this in my own earlier work too, is dominated by still, kind of the old chiefdom models, right? And a lot of archaeologists have sort of tried to jam Western North Carolina into, models that are developed to explain things that happened at Cahokia and Etowah, And I think there's a lot of evidence in this particular corner of the world that, decision-making by councils, decision-making through, reasoned debate and discussion in public buildings where everybody can kind of come around and watch and talk about it, as opposed to edicts from on high on top of a mound, is a really long-standing tradition. And that's an idea that's really worth thinking about, and we have some more material record for that. Thinking about houses and families offers a really important kind of corrective to the discipline as a way to kind of center women and families in archaeology. So again, thinking about the idea that houses are built by families and for families, this is a really good place for really thinking about daily lived experience in communities and not overlooking the important contributions that kids and women also make to the archaeological record that tends to get overlooked. And then finally, as archaeologists, we spend, because we tend to think in time periods, right? And I've been doing it up here a little bit, talking about the early Pisgah phase versus the middle Qualla phase, right? We tend to draw these dividing lines between peoples, and this is also a way to think about, in a more continuous way, a sort of testament to Cherokee resilience and Cherokee adaptation. And again, to step back with like a really big idea and to even introduce a new idea in your conclusion, which is terrible public speaking, but I'm going to do it anyway, right? We make a lot of the transition from winter summer houses to cabins between 1760 and 1820, right? Like, and that switch to cabins is often discussed as like, evidence of assimilation, right? We could also think about cabins as a small domestic structure for a family that then also has a council house for community decision making, right? And so if we think about that really old model of you have a relatively modest house for your family, and then you have these large public buildings for community meetings, that's a very old pattern that we can see goes back 1,000 years. And so while we get really hung up sometimes in like technological changes in houses, there's all these institutions and decision making by council, decision making by lineage, an appropriate size for your house, needing a big enough public space to let people come in and discuss things and make decisions. That's a thing that's actually has a lot of continuity in the archaeological record. So those are just, I think, a few things we can talk about, think about from this new work. And I'm going to stop there because lunch is in 10 minutes. And this way I'll have time to answer some questions, and you'll have a minute to get ready for lunch. Is that cool? Is that okay? Yeah, there's lots of question up front. Is there stuff that's older than 2,000 years? I really like houses, so I like the last 2,000 years because post holes hold up better. But yes, lots of excellent evidence. So going back to 10,000 years easily here in North Carolina and even earlier. So just one example, Middle Archaic period projectile points that we found in the general location of the science building. So lots and lots of good archaic evidence. When I sometimes, on my lunch break, will go run the cross-country fields and like mountain biking fields at Western, which is dangerous because it's mostly mountain bikers, so I actually don't recommend it. But you find Middle Archaic quartz projectile points and flakes in the saddles and stuff up in those fields all the time. So that's yeah. I would expand on it a little bit. My colleague, Dr. Brett Race, could do a whole lot better. So I'm going to give a very condensed version, and then you can talk with Brett about the archival records for Two-Sparrows Town. But yeah, it's specifically mentioned in early 19th century documents as being a particularly important and special and sacred place on the landscape at the head of the Tuckasegee. So, when can you say definitively this is Cherokee? That is a really hard question, but I have a slide for that. And I'm going to tell you right now, you're probably going to be disappointed. So expectations management, but I came prepared. If you haven't read this book, I really recommend it. It's by David Troyer. He's an Ojibwe writer who's also a Princeton-educated anthropologist. This book, Heartbeat of Wounded Knee. And he writes the following, and he has this paragraph at the end of his Tour de Force Chapter 1, where he summarizes all of North American archaeology in about 30 pages. I make my undergraduates read it. It's really impressive. And he's talking about the way that archaeologists tend to talk about indigenous cultures in the past as one group of people just replacing each other, wave after wave after wave of people, which is a very settler colonial way to think about people, right? One group replaces another. So this is from Troyer. Many Indians do not see themselves as merely the first in a long series of arrivals to North America. They see themselves as indigenous, and that belief in tribal indigeneity is crucial to understanding modern Indian realities. The rhetorical stance that Indians are merely one group of travelers, with no greater stake than any other, clashes with Indians' cultural understanding that we've always been here and that our control over our place in the world, not to mention our control over the narrative and history of that place, has been deeply and unjustly eroded. So the question of when is Cherokee identity, and that's a really complicated question. And I think it's an identity that's been around for a long time, but I think that it's one that we can't strictly get at from house patterns. That's a great question. So family size, right? And like household size and stuff. So a couple of thoughts. One, I think people are spending a whole lot more time outside of their houses, just day to day, right? And so for one thing, you know, if you're mostly using them for sleeping and storage and really hunkering down in the wintertime, you know, when it's cold and stuff, you certainly don't need the 1960s 1,200 square foot brick ranch house just for your family. But yeah, I think you're mostly looking at like nuclear and extended families, so maybe like 6 or 8 people per house, and certainly, you know, in a pinch, you could get more, you know, get more folks in there. But that's probably about right. And again, thinking really broadly about North American archaeology, it is really cool to compare that kind of, you know, southeastern pattern of probably mostly nuclear and extended families, you know, kind of one per house, compared to like apartment style building and stuff that you see in some other cultures. So yeah, that's great. So, you know, broadly, now we're all going to get motion sick. I'm the worst presenter ever. Yeah, like with these historic Cherokee households, you know, and we have like more historic accounts to pull from, but household scale gardens, so growing, you know, corn, beans, and squash and other stuff, really like right up to the house, and then also community scale gardens as well. And so that's probably what you're seeing is a combination of household gardens, household produce, and then and that's a practice that goes way back, and then kind of bigger communal fields where there's more corn stuff being grown, kind of for community scale consumption and stuff.
Do you think that influenced the spacing?
Oh, absolutely, yeah. I think, you know, garden space, field spacing, arable soils, slope aspect. I mean, you can get into a lot of fun kind of brass tack stuff with site placement when you start thinking about how it relates to agriculture, for sure. I think food's a great place to stop, and there might even be corn out there. I don't know, no promises, but thank you all so much. I really appreciate it.